This week's video is going to be a show and tell about all the quilts I've done so far. Hello and welcome to my channel. Every single Wednesday I upload new videos right here. They're generally about how to use your sewing machine or simple sewing tips and tricks. I generally don't film outdoors. I'm only doing this because it's the natural sunlight and I want to show my quilts off the best way possible. Quilt number one isn't actually here. Quilt number one was a gift that I gave away as a baby quilt. So I currently have 4 quilts to show you. So quilt number one was given away as a gift. It was basically just square, simple square quilt. It was so ridiculously easy and just did not challenge me at all. So once I created the squares, I then used a fireside backing and just flipped it out and then just did the regular stitch in the ditch. So it was really quite simple. This here is quilt number 2, where I wanted to pick up my A game a little. So I just got into quilting and going into quilt shops, and I found these wonderful things called jelly rolls. At the time I really wanted a challenge, and the challenge came with the border of this quilt. These crisscrosses were kind of challenging to do because I didn't really know much about bias back then. It was also the first quilt that I had to unpick all of the free motion quilting. This was only a lap size quilt, so it wasn't too much of a big deal. I mean, it did take a long time. And back then I didn't really know how to do binding properly. So this is what it ended up looking like. It's terrible. You can also see where it hasn't been done properly at the front either. But we all have to learn somewhere, and this was my second quilt. One of the lessons that I learned from this quilt was obviously that I needed to get much better at my binding, but also how cutting on the bias affects stretch, because overall this quilt isn't exactly rectangular. Moving on to my second quilt, I wanted to go much bigger, and this is a quilt that I made for my mum. My mum still lives in the UK and she lives in an old Victorian house, so I wanted to use fabric that was traditional to her home. I think the fabric is by Moda, and I know it's definitely called French General. Now I think I used a block that was shown by Missouri Star Company. I can't remember. I generally don't use quilt patterns. I will find a block I like and just work from there. And I just made a big wide border for the drop of a double bed. They also had French General backing, so it's kind of reversible, this quilt. And on this quilt I still didn't quite get the binding correct, but don't forget this is still only my third quilt. And this is the front. You can see I've used 2 different threads. So in my bobbin I've got cream, and in my thread is this like wine red colour, and in the main part of the quilt I still used the cream, and then the cream in the bobbin. My label was created from a black Sharpie, which I would not do again because I can do that from my Baby Lock Soprano. This is where I went a bit more adventurous with learning how to do some free motion quilting. You can barely see it because I wanted it all to be matchy-matchy, so if I did make any errors they wouldn't show up, and really you can't see hardly any of it. I've got to really zoom in to look at any of the free motion. So what I learned from this quilt was to be a lot more adventurous with my free motion quilting and have a lot more confidence in doing free motion quilting. This here is my 4th ever quilt and I love it. The stars are paper pieced, and I was very much into paper piecing at the time. So the block is just that star block, and then I came up with the lines in between. So you all know that I'm a lover of this holographic thread, and that is what I used in some of this border. The reason for the colours is to match my living room. I have a brown and teal colour scheme. Now I didn't want to overkill this quilt because I didn't want to take away from the stars, and each star took me like 3 hours to create, so you can understand how long it probably took me to build this quilt. The background of this quilt is done in Moda Grunge, which I love because it had some teal aspects to it, and it was helping to pull out some of the teal of that star, even though it didn't really need it. I also did holographic thread in the squares, and you can see now how my binding is getting much better. This quilt isn't totally perfect. I did error on the reverse, and I'll show you. So I decided to go with brown on the bottom and brown on the top, and I don't like the way that this looks personally. So as you can see here, the dark brown, I'm not really liking it, and you can see some of my errors as well. And this here is caused by not pulling your bobbin thread through to the top of your quilt. I think if I would have chosen something that was a bit more the same colour on the reverse, I would have got away with some of these errors. And don't forget, this is all using my Baby Lock Soprano. I have not used a long arm on any of my quilts. So one of the lessons I learned here was to really try and match your thread to the quilt, and to also not forget to pull that bobbin thread through. This is my most recent quilt. The pattern was out of a magazine. Apart from the binding, everything is done out of scraps. I want to give everybody that follows me some encouragement, because as you can see from my second quilt to my last quilt, you can see improvement. My binding is absolutely excellent. And the reverse was also made out of scraps. Now, I had a previous video where I showed you how to create this label. This is the quilt that label went to. What I learned about this quilt was to learn to work with what we have. This was all done out of scraps, and by placing the colours in a strategic manner, it looks really good. I also learned how to make a label. I am now super confident with my binding, and I also went a little bit more adventurous with my free motion quilting. I hope you've enjoyed my show and tell of all the quilts that I've done so far. If you have a favourite, let me know in the comments down below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss seeing me next week. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.